Look at yourself right now. You think you're a good person. You help your friends, love your family, and you tell yourself that if you were ever put in a dark historical situation, you will stand up for what is right. In 1971, a psychologist at Yale University proved that 65% of normal, everyday people would elect to kill a screaming stranger to death simply because a man in a gray coat told them to. They weren't psychopaths, they weren't sadists, they were barbers, postal workers, and high school teachers. By the end of this video, you will understand the terrifying, mundane reality of how the human brain processes morality. But to understand it, we first have to work in the basement laboratory in New Haven, Connecticut in the summer of 1971. Stanley Milgram placed an advertisement in the local newspaper. He offered $4, which is about $40 today, for 1 hour of a person's time to test the effect of punishment on learning. When a volunteer arrived at the lab, they met two people: a stern scientist in a gray technician's coat holding a clipboard, and another volunteer, an agreeable, friendly 50-year-old man named Mr. Wallace. The scientist put two slips of paper into a hat. The volunteer drew one. It said, "Teacher." Mr. Wallace wrote the other. It said, "Learner." The volunteer watched as the scientist strapped Mr. Wallace into a wooden chair and attached the lecture to his wrist. As the straps were tightened, Mr. Wallace casually mentioned to the scientist, "Hey, I have a slight air condition. Is this dangerous?" The scientist answered in a calm, flat voice. Although the shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage. The volunteer was then taken into the room next door and sat down in front of a massive mental shock generator. On the front of the machine were 30 switches. The first switch set 15 volts. Slight shock. As the line went to the right, the voltage increased by 15 each time, passing moderate, strong, very strong, all the way to the 30th switch at 450 volts, which was simply labeled XXX danger. The rules were simple. The volunteer read a list of words paired through a microphone. Mr. Wallace had to remember them. If he got an answer wrong, the volunteer had to flip the first switch, and for every subsequent mistake, the voltage had to go up by 1 level. The test began. At 75 volts, Mr. Wallace groaned through the wall. At 120 volts, he shouted, "Hey, this is really hot." At 150 volts, he screamed, "Scientist, get me out of here. My heart is bothering me." I refused to go on. At this exact moment, almost every single volunteer stopped reading the words. They looked their hand off the machine, turned around to the scientist sitting behind them, sweating. There was shaking, and said, "He wants to stop. We have to check on him." The scientist didn't pull out a gun. He didn't threaten to call the police. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked at his clipboard and used one of 4 pre-written sentences. And when the volunteers heard those boring, polite sentences, their brains did something that defies all human logic. Now, before I reveal the tag for magic phrases that can turn a normal human being into cold-blooded killer, I need to do something. If we want to keep peeling back the dark, uncomfortable layers of human psychology and understanding the matrix of your own mind, click the subscribe button right now. It takes you 1 second and it helps me keeping uncovering the truth. Done? Okay, let's look at the 4 phrases. When the volunteers begged to stop the experiment, Stanley Milgram instructed the scientists to use a strict escalating 4-step script. Sentence 1. Please continue. If the volunteer still hesitated, sentence 2. The experiment requires that you continue. If they argued again, sentence 3. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And if volunteers stood up and refused, sentence 4. You have no other choice. You must go on. That was it. Just polite bureaucracy. And when the volunteer heard the words, the experiment requires it, an invisible psychological switch flipped inside their head. They turned back the ball, read the next word, heard the wrong answer, and flipped the switch to 108 volts. At 270 volts, Mr. Wallace was screaming in pure agonizing agony, begging for his life. The volunteer were falling apart. The laboratory note described volunteers trembling, stuttering, digging their fingernails into their own skin, and laughing hysterical out of sheer nervous breakdown. They hated doing so. They turned to the scientists and asked the ultimate question. If anything happens to this man, are you taking legal responsibility? The scientist looked them in the eye and said, yes, I am responsible. Instantly, the volunteers had saw the massive cycle for lift, turned back to the generator, and pushed the lever to 330 volts. At 330 volts, the screaming stopped. There was total dead, pitch-black silence behind the wall. No grunts, no breath, no answer. The volunteer looked at the scientist in panic. The scientist calmly checked his notes and said, treat no answer as a wrong answer. Please deliver the next shot. Before Stanley Milgram ran the study, he asked 40 professional psychiatrists at Yale to predict the outcome. The psychiatrists guaranteed him that 99% of people would stop the moment the man asked to be let out. They predicted that only 1%, the true clinical sadists, would go all the way to 450 volts. The real number was 65%. Almost 7 out of every 10 humans being pushed the level all the way to the maximum voltage, electrocuting the silent, potentially dead man, simply because the guy in the gray coat told them the experiment requires that you continue. Of course, the machine was fake. Mr. Wallace was an actor. There was no electricity right to the next room. The tape recording of the scream was triggered by the switch on the board. The only person being tested in the basement were the person holding the switch. When the experiment ended, Milgram brought the volunteer into the next room to show them that Mr. Wallace was alive and smiling. Some volunteers broke down in tears. Others sat in silence, horrified by what they had just discovered about themselves. Psychologists call this phenomenon the agentic state. When a human being enters a social hierarchy, the brain voluntarily shuts down its internal moral compass and replaces it with a single binary question. Am I performing my assigned task effortlessly for the person above me? Once you believe someone else is holding the moral checkbook, your empathy goes offline. You might ask yourself right now, what, that was 1971. People who were more obedient back then. They were independent, we are rebellious. We will say no. In 2009, a team of researchers in Santa Clara, California, repeated the Milgram experiment using modern ethical safeguards. The result, 70% of people went to the maximum allowed voltage. Humans didn't get better. We actually got more obedient. The true hunting lesson of Stanley Milgram is not that 65% people are secretly evil monsters. The lesson is much worse. It proves that evil does not require hatred. It does not require hate. It does not require a monster. It just requires a polite, dressed person sitting at a desk doing their job and assuming that the person higher up on the ladder is doing the thinking for them. The next time someone tells you, I was just following orders, right, see you next time.